Our first guest today is Frieda Wallison. Frieda is the chair of the Pitkin County Republicans. And what we're going to do today is continue our discussion about civility or lack of civility in politics, and did we ever have it, and how we lost it, and can we get it back? Frieda is a Harvard-educated attorney, which puts me at a significant disadvantage for this conversation. And I was looking at her bio. She's obviously had terrific accomplishments within the law, but she's branched out the law. She was actually a trustee for the Shakespeare Theater Company in Washington. We could probably have a more interesting conversation about what the Shakespeare Theater Company did in Washington, but we're going to stick to politics today. And if I have to say anything about Frieda Wallison, I've known her for about 8 years now, and when I think of Frieda, I just think of someone who's a class act. And I don't think anyone could meet Frieda and have a different opinion. And if you do, then you and I won't be civil with each other, because she is definitely a class act. Particularly given being involved in politics and playing an influential role in politics, I always known her to have an even keel, and never really say something that I thought was out of the ordinary or disrespectful to anyone. So it's a pleasure to have her with us today on the show. So welcome, Frieda.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, not only a class act, I have to tell you, when we were starting to get ready for filming today, the crew here said, "Who's your guest?" And I said, "Frieda Wallison." And their faces lit up. They said, "Frieda comes in all the time, and she's a class act." So I stole their line.
This is wonderful. I think I'll leave now.
So is that the ultimate oxymoron, chair of the Pitkin County Republicans and class act?
No, not at all. See now, where's your civility?
No civility, exactly.
No, I frankly, being chair of the Pitkin County Republicans is very interesting. It's also a challenge in a town or county that tends liberal. And obviously we tend to have some different perspectives on a lot of issues. And it's interesting to try to get our perspective across, not necessarily agreed with, but across in a way that can be understood by people who have a different view.
Now, I'm trying to remember, I don't recall exactly. You didn't exactly campaign for this job. Wasn't it kind of thrust upon you
Yes,
in
that's
an
right.
opportune time?
Well, that's right. It was the middle of the 2008 presidential campaign. And my predecessor had spoken with me about possibly becoming chair. And we agreed that it would make sense to do that if I was going to do it after the campaign season. But for one reason or another, in September of 2008, my predecessor decided to step down, and I stepped up.
Well, you can't just step up without people knowing how talented you are, but you also can't step up unless you are ready for that. So take us back a bit, somewhere after Harvard Law School and between becoming chairman. Were you active in politics early on? How did you get started in politics? And
I wasn't active in the way I am today as chair, but I have been around politics for most of my life, both in New York City, where I practiced law part of my career, and in Washington, D.C., and mostly, I think, as a result of my husband's being as involved as he was in government positions. And it's hard to be in that milieu and not be part of politics. And then, of course, some of the things I did in my career, particularly when I was in Washington, were not strictly political, but I was operating in a political environment. I was a member of a 5-member commission that was appointed by, I was a presidential appointee to study the state of the nation's infrastructure. That's a pretty political kind of situation. I was also vice chair of the Financial Advisory Board of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. That was pretty political because we were wrestling with the question of cost-benefit from environmental regulations. And you had folks on one side who thought that that should not even be a consideration, that what needed to happen was regulation of the environment, and the costs associated with that were unimportant. People on the other side, of course, thinking that these things should be balanced, and the cost was important in determining whether a regulation would be put in place. So almost anything one does is political in a sense. Right. But I was clearly heavily involved in some sense vicariously through my husband when he had various governmental positions.
Right, and when you say your husband, Peter Wallison, was an earlier guest on our show. We talked about campaign finance reform with him, and if I recall correctly, he was counsel to President Reagan, or was in the White House counsel capacity.
He was White House counsel.
And then later was general counsel to Treasury.
Before being White House counsel,
I got him
he
reversed.
was general counsel. He also, at one point in his wanderings, was counsel to Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. And before that, he was a special counsel to Nelson Rockefeller while Rockefeller was governor of New York. So we've been in and out of politics in a lot of different
But
capacities.
in those days and in those roles, you were more at the policy level. I mean, you're helping to create policy and discuss implications of government.
Well, he certainly was.
But even on these commissions you were part of.
But on the commissions I was part of, yes, very much so. But politics also, you know, policy is politics, and politics is policy also. So I don't necessarily see a separation. I do think that policy is critical, you know, you want to be sure that you're doing the right thing, aside from whatever the, quote, politics of the matter is, or are. And so policy lies, I think, at the base of what people do in Washington and what people involved in the political arena care about.
And I agree with you. So when you were on these commissions, and had you been appointed by a Republican president?
Yes. Well, I was appointed by Ronald Reagan.
By Reagan.
To the Commission on Infrastructure. And maybe it was because of that the folks at the Environmental Protection Agency, still in the Reagan administration, thought that it would make sense for me to be on this other board.
I guess what I was trying to get at is you obviously have an amazing intellectual capacity. You have curiosity about these issues you're dealing with. But as a presidential appointee, do you feel you're also there, as you said, maybe wearing a little bit of a political hat, so that as decisions are getting made, that's kind of in the back of your mind?
I think what I was trying to get across is that if you're a member of a board or a commission like that, I wasn't necessarily thinking what would Ronald Reagan want me to conclude as a member of this commission. I was really thinking at the time of, you know, what makes most sense.
Right.
And there was a sense at that particular moment that, and I think it's true probably today too, that not enough attention is being paid to our infrastructure in the country, and that could be a problem. Somehow we managed to get through all this, but so the politics of thinking about that, I mean, there are politics involved, but it wasn't, but more in the sense of how do you reconcile a lot of different perspectives on what should be done and where should it be done and how much should it cost. There are lots of different views on that, and so that's where I think the politics comes in.
Gotcha. So somewhere along the line, though, we have to transition you to becoming the chair of the
Yes.
party, and being chair of the party is as pure politics as you can get. You're trying to get people elected. So
That's true.
Where did you grow into someone who might be able to wear that kind of a hat?
Well, you know, as you said, this wasn't something that I necessarily sought. It was thrust upon me, but having had it thrust upon me and having thought about whether this is something I was willing to undertake, you know, I stepped in and I decided I would try to make the best of it and do as good a job as I could. Whether I've done that is another question, but, and it's a continual challenge, and if I have the sense that I spend about 40 hours at minimum a week on this. There is always something to be done, always some other, you know, thing, some email to send, some challenge,
Yeah.
some email to send out to our network about some topic, some candidate, whatever, working with candidates. We have a lot of candidates coming to Pitkin County, so working with them and coordinating that, developing programs, which we've tried to do on a fairly regular basis, that will, you know, that involve people who have ideas and thoughts about topics of the day.
And I tip my hat to you, because I am on your email list, and I think you bring in great speakers, and I've been to some of your sessions, and I think you really do a great job of educating, you know, people who want to come up to speed on contemporary issues.
That's, you know, that's a big, big part. And another way to talk about politics is to say it really does involve education, because you know, if you're involved in this sphere, you want to tell people, make them aware of why you think the way you think on a particular issue, or why a particular candidate thinks that way. So, you know, that's the essence of education. You're trying to get a point across and convince somebody else that why it's important and what it means.
So you've had a couple interesting election cycles. You were
Yes.
you were thrust into the election 2008 on the cusp
Right.
of Obama being elected, and then you've now gone through a whole cycle for the Obama-Romney election. So
Yes.
what lessons have been learned throughout that in terms of your approach to elections and how you think about elections?
Well, you know, as a party hack,
Your word, not mine.
right, I'm not sure that that there's, our role is to try to support the candidate by talking with other people about the candidate, trying to convince them that the candidate should be elected. To some extent, the ebb and flow of a campaign is outside our control. We're not on the campaign team, so we're not in a position to advise the candidate. But of course, that also depends on gradations. Typically not in a position to advise a presidential candidate on what his or her position should be, or the direction of the campaign. But we do often get involved at a lower level, for example, state house representative, state senate senator, in a more fundamental way on what are the issues, how should they be presented in Pitkin County at least, and that sort of thing.
So let's switch over a little bit then. When we get to issues, I want to talk about civility. These candidates come through town. I assume a lot of them are going to be interviewed by the newspaper.
Right.
So do you help them
Yes.
prepare for that give and take with the paper?
Well, no, but I do certainly help set up those kinds of meetings.
Would you tell them?
But I don't tell them what they should say, or, you know, I maybe there's a, maybe I'll say, you know, these are the issues that are important to people here, and if you could focus on one or another, it would be important. Yes, I have been known to say that.
So what is your perspective on civility? I mean, most people think we're losing civility if we ever had it. In fact,
Yeah.
before the show started, that was your quip. Did we ever have it, right?
Well, I do think there's that question, whether we ever had it, but I think that it's clearly not a very good situation right now. And I give a fair amount of thought to this. I think we're living in an age of where people really are, I suspect, more separated from each other than they were before. By that I mean people of like mind tend to read the same material on the internet or newspapers, watch the same television programs, if they're involving current affairs. Don't really get down to discussions with each other if they have opposing perspectives, so that there's a lot of reinforcement of views that are held to be truths on both sides. And so I think that's one of the problems. The two sides don't get together and talk. And so what they're both getting are reinforcements of their, wherever they started out. There's also a tendency to, the world is very complicated right now. And it's very difficult to get facts, and people marshal facts, even if they get them, to reinforce their particular perspective. And facts are very malleable. So you can find facts that are going to support your view, and the other side is going to find facts that support their view. I mean, just the topic of the day on the CBO report, Congressional Budget Office report on the question of how much full-time employment will there be in 10 or so years.
As a function of Obamacare.
As a function of Obamacare. And, the Republicans are looking at that one way, and the Democrats are looking at it a rather different way.
And we've said on the show many times, politics is a contact sport.
Yes.
I mean, it's not all niceties.
Right.
But it seems to me we've lost our ability to compromise, and what bothers me is the words that get spoken in this environment you're talking about. They're very heated words. They're very contentious, heated words, and I don't remember that even 20 years ago.
Right.
And so how have we transitioned to this point?
I can't, recall. I'd have to generally agree with you, Steve, because I can't recall where people were calling each other names. And there's a lot of name calling on both sides. I think that and I view that as somewhat different than compromise. I mean, lately we have seen that the parties in Congress have compromised on some legislation. They've just recently compromised on the Farm Bill. The Republicans didn't get everything they wanted. The Democrats didn't get everything they wanted. There was, in fact, after a bit of unpleasantness, a compromise on the budget. So, but that's different in my view from the question of how do people talk with each other about issues. There's where I think the civility factor comes in. And I do think that leadership is very important. I think leaders have to bear a heavy responsibility in providing a model for people at lower rungs of the ladder, and how to talk about to the other side. So I think in many instances leaders have failed. I also think that journalists bear a heavy responsibility in this regard, and the journalists are really, they're off,
Correct.
the deep end. Peter just had an op-ed in the New York Times that attracted a lot of attention, and there was a blog in the Columbia Journalism Review by one of the editors of that review. This is the review for Columbia University School of Journalism, and it was headed in reference to my husband's opinion piece, "The Big Lie." Now, when journalists are talking in that sense, particularly journalists associated with one of the premier academic institutions in journalism in the country, you really despair, actually, about anybody talking civilly about anything to each other. Another example, I was watching one of the pundit programs on the Sunday morning talk shows on television, and subject was Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, and Ezekiel Emanuel, Rahm Emanuel's brother, one of his brothers, Ezekiel Emanuel was very involved in the formulation of the Affordable Care Act.
Is he a physician, I think?
He is a physician. I think he's currently and this is also, to me, very astounding, he's the provost or vice provost of the University of Pennsylvania. And he was on the show with, this particular show with a guy named James Capretta, who is also an expert in health economics and that sort of thing, healthcare economics. And the conversation got very heated, and at one point, the moderator said to Ezekiel Emanuel, "Well, isn't Mr. Capretta making a good point?" To which Ezekiel Emanuel said, "I don't care what he's saying. He's only saying something because he wants to defeat the Affordable Care Act." Well, when you start out with that perspective, that you're not going to listen to somebody else with another view because you are suspicious that he is only out to undermine you or your position, then you never get to a conversation, and you never get to determine whether either one of you is making valid points.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're doing. When people are talking at each other, not with each other.
Right.
And again, the language is horrible. And you referenced
Right.
calling people a liar, which seems to be okay now.
That's
Calling the president a liar seems to be okay now.
True. True.
I never thought we'd get to that point in time.
Right.
Even if you thought the president made a mistake or misspoke,
right.
You didn't take it to the level
You
that
didn't
I
use
think
the
we're at
L
today.
word.
You definitely didn't use the L word. So how do we get back? How do we get back here? How does the Republican Party, how's the chair of the Pitkin County Republican Party help us get back to some modicum of civility here? Is there any?
Well, I think we truly make an effort to, some of us anyway, talk with, I should say, not talk to, but talk with people who have a different viewpoint. And I think in this town, it's really incumbent upon us to do that. We are outnumbered. We want to be able to talk to people. So I think that it's pretty important, an important part certainly of how I see my role is to say I'm a Republican for this, and this reason, and I'd like to have a conversation with you. And I do that, you know. So, and it always has to be on a very civil, even keel basis.
Right now, as a Republican, as the chair of the party, how much tension do you feel with the Tea Party element and the fact that a lot of people want to blame them for their, I hate the word extreme, but they get blamed for extreme positions of wanting to shut down government. Is there a lot of tension in your job? Do you feel that at the local level, or is that just That's not in
I
Pitkin County
don't think
yet.
I feel that quite so much. I think it is a factor in the Republican Party in Colorado and probably in many other states. I think the Tea Party started out on a very well-founded basis of concerns about the deficit and debt and fiscal matters generally. It seems to have morphed a bit into a more intense emotional kind of approach to things. And I think that may possibly be because there are a lot of people who identify themselves as Tea Party people who have not been involved in politics before, have a rather blunderbuss approach to dealing with the issues, and maybe over time that gets modulated a bit. But I think that certainly some of the, maybe most of the principles that seem to have animated the formation of the Tea Party are still of concern. Budget, budget, deficit, spending, taxes, all of those kinds of things. So, but I haven't felt particularly affected by that.
No, we have our political leadership.
And I might also say, if I may, that Democrats seem to have had great success in evoking the Tea Party as an evil group. I mean, that's sort of how it comes across. If you say Tea Party, it's to describe somebody who's evil.
And again, I think
the government shutdown, which was a very bad way to go, in my view, however, served to illustrate that there are a diversity of views within the Republican Party. There were Republicans who were for pushing this question of funding or defunding Obamacare to a shutdown if necessary, and there were a lot of Republicans who thought that was foolhardy and should not be pursued. And I think that at the end of the day, it gave some of us relief that, yes, it was clear that there were different points of view within the Republican Party, and it wasn't right to label everybody as a Tea Party person with the connotation that Tea Party is evil. So.
Now, someone said, maybe Shakespeare, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't see sausages or legislation being made.
Yes.
Do you think we just see too much of it? Do you think we see every little snippet of every little action and every little sentence that anyone would be better off if we didn't have all that information and we could?
Well, I don't know
too much
about
information a bad thing here?
Well, it might be. I think there's a tendency when you have too much information to try to boil it down to a very simple slogan, if you will, to make it understandable, both on the part of the person who's getting the information and on the part of the person who's giving it. So, so that's not good. And we do have too much information, but we're always going to have too much information.
That
and
one we can't put back in the bottle.
And we can't put it
No,
back
not
in the
that one.
bottle, and I think we've got to learn how to deal with it, but do it in a calmer way, and say, here are the main points here, and here are the main points here, and, somewhere in between lies the truth.
Right. So we're coming to the end of our time, and one last trick question for you. So in Pitkin County, we have women leadership of the Republicans and the Democrats.
Yes.
And when I'm back lobbying, I'll be with women legislators, and they'll be talking about the deals being made, and the phrase will be, there's a little too much testosterone in the room right now. So do we need more women in government?
Number one, I'm for people who are effective in government. I do think women have a lot to bring to the table. They do come at a lot of issues from a different perspective than men often do. And women may be a little better at compromising and finding a way to try to meld a lot of different viewpoints. So I think I'm saying it would be a good thing if more women became involved. I think it would be a very good thing if more people became involved in politics. I mean, fundamentally, this affects all our lives. And I don't think you have the luxury of sitting back and saying, I'm not going to pay any attention to these issues or to politics. Politics is the way issues get decided. And so I think all of us should be a lot more involved. And I don't think we take seriously enough the wonderful gift we've been given of the right to vote. I mean, when you look at this, the statistics of how many people vote in any given election, it's shocking. I just came back from Peru,
Right.
and I was told by our guides in Peru that voting is mandatory in Peru.
And Australia and a few other places.
And in
right.
Australia. I'm kind of thinking that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, thank you.
Thank you,
Anybody who's
Steve.
watched this segment, hopefully has gotten educated, entertained, and they now know what a class act Frieda Wallison is. So
Well,
thanks for
thank
joining
you.
us.
Thank you very much.